Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Unexpected Goals. This is going to be your Arsenal versus PSG first leg Champions League preview. I'm going to split these up into two different videos and two different podcast episodes. I'll have Barcelona and Inter out sometime tomorrow. But what I thought I'd do here is these two met at the very beginning of the Champions League league phase and Arsenal won the match 2-0. I thought what I would do is I would go through and do a tactical analysis essentially of that match and then see what from that match applies to this meeting now because obviously it's been 7 months. There's a lot of different players that have played for both of these teams, a lot of new players. So I'm just going to dive right in here. First up, we're just going to kind of go by first half, second half, and then at the end, I'll do a little preview like I normally would for a podcast like this. So, first up, you can see if you want to if you're listening to this in podcast form, if you I'm going to mention images essentially throughout this. If you like, I'll say like this image here. It's available on my YouTube channel if you'd like to watch the video. If you can, please subscribe. If not, that's okay. I don't really care. Um, but you can see right here the two lineups that we had. A little bit different for PSG. Dembele didn't play, and obviously this was in October, so Kvaratskhelia wasn't available. They played Kang and Lee as kind of a false nine. He really was quite awful in that type of role. But the same back line for PSG, pretty much the same midfield, except for Zaire Emery was in there instead of Fabio and Ruiz. Desiree Doué was playing out at right wing, but he's obviously played a big role for PSG this season. So Arsenal with a 4-4-2. Odegaard wasn't available for this match. It was when he was hurt. So for a while and for a couple matches when they were playing good in possession teams, Arsenal just went straight 4-4-2. Highly doubt they'll do that in this match. They'll probably go with some type of 4-3-3 would be my guess. But right off the bat here right off the bat, Arsenal was pressing PSG high, and they were doing an outstanding job of doing it. They were transitioning from their zonal 4-4-2 into a man-to-man press. And what happened is essentially PSG was really trying to build down the left side. Typically with PSG's buildup, they like to build down the left side a little bit more than they do the right. They like to advance Hakimi up and invert him a lot more than Nuno Mendes. Obviously, both of their fullbacks advance and cause a lot of problems when they get into the attack because, guys like Vitinha and João Neves, they will drop into the back line. And we'll go through obviously the positional rotations for PSG and how, they apply to this match. But the problem for PSG was, for if you're a team that is not very physical and really doesn't have a root of playing long, playing teams like Arsenal can be feel like going to the dentist. Honestly, it's really really difficult. When you have obviously PSG loves to drop their forwards in, and like I mentioned, all their positional rotations and everything. What Arsenal's press is kind of designed to do, it's kind of similar to Bournemouth's press in some aspects, is they love to pin you to one side, and essentially you have two options. You either can because they're so good at closing down the ball, it's very, very difficult to play a lot of short passes through them. They like to make sure that they never get overloaded. The center backs, this is a very important point, the center backs will always track the forwards that go forward. They are not where Arsenal is not worried about getting beat over the top because their defenders are so good and they're so good at defending in transition. That's the thing that happened with Liverpool when they played PSG is Liverpool's center backs did not want to come up and follow because they were left their fullbacks on islands and their fullbacks really aren't that good at defending. Arsenal throughout this entire first leg was constantly Saliba, Timber, Gabriel, whoever it was, if Kang and Lee or Barcola was dropping deep, had a defender following him all the time and made it incredibly difficult. That made it so PSG could not get in midfield overload or even overload out wide through the first or second phases of buildup. And with how good Arsenal is at closing them down, well, it makes it very difficult to actually play through them. And as you'll see on the screen right here, this is from Mark's stats, 40 danger zone losses from PSG. But I want to see you to see the location of where they were. They were all down this left side of the pitch. Just a huge cluster right there in that left side. That's because Jurrien Timber and Saliba were constantly tracking runners that were coming in here. And it made it so difficult for PSG because then when they had to play long, they really didn't have anybody long to play to. It was just Kang and Lee, and he's not somebody who's going to win duels against Saliba or Gabriel. So Arsenal just kept turning them over and over again in the first half, and PSG could just found absolutely no way of playing through. I'll show you a couple images here of what I mean by the center backs tracking and following him. So here, Nuno Mendes, they get basically pinned into the left corner here, which happened over and over and over again. And so really the only option he has here, because there's, either you have to play the ball centrally or you have to play a switch pass and obviously Arsenal's fullbacks are very good at reading those switch passes and their center backs are very good at reading passes that go centrally. He tries to play a ball over the top, but as you can see, that's Saliba right there who tracks Barcola right into the space here and ends up winning the duel. And essentially, PSG just could not find a way through. Now, the flip side of it is PSG's press, which has been very effective throughout most of the Champions League, was not intense and really wasn't good enough here against Arsenal. There were constantly situations where, Calafiori was playing at left back in, October. Obviously, Miles Lewis-Skelly will play left back here, but they kept inverting and having him play wide. His rotate his positional rotations were kind of causing PSG a little bit of problems. Here's an example. He stays out wide. Party's able to find space centrally because PSG just really wasn't that intense. They weren't really good at closing Arsenal down, and he's able to find Timber, who just advances past Barcola here pretty simply. And then he's got a ton of space to run into, and Arsenal had a 2v1 out wide with Saka. Arsenal did open the scoring with a brilliant individual dribbling effort by by Trossard, who found Havertz in the box. Obviously, Havertz is not going to play in this match, but I'll get to that later. Why I think crossing essentially might be very very important in this match for Arsenal. I'll save that for the preview. But you know what was working for Arsenal as well, especially after they went up 1-0, is their positional rotations. Like their team very similar to PSG. Their rotations are incredibly fluid. You'll constantly see Moreno or Rice, or actually Rice has been playing more advanced role. I meant to say Odegaard will drop deep and try to bring center backs with them. Against Real Madrid, they were kind of scared of following them that far up, and obviously Real Madrid's forwards and Rodrigo just weren't doing much defensive work, which allowed, free runs in there. The image I'm going to show you here, you know, Havertz was playing as one of the two strikers, so William Pacho was tasked with marking him. And you can see in this image here that he was pretty hesitant at dropping all the way here to cover Havertz. And you can see the amount of space that is left here. Well, what he does is he's vacating all of this space behind him. And now Saka is left 1v1 against Nuno Mendes, which I'm guessing is a matchup that Mikel Arteta is going to hammer over and over again in this match. And I would guess, Arsenal is going to do similarly to what I'm about to show you here. Essentially, PSG started becoming more and more aggressive with their pressing because they were losing 1-0. And Arsenal was drawing in that press and then just starting to play the ball long. Here you can see that they draw the press in, they play the ball long. Martinelli comes down with the ball, and Rice essentially beats his man, and acres of space to just run into. And Arsenal had a break. They ended up messing this one up. But you can see situations like this where I think you'll see Arsenal really try to win those duels and essentially win second balls. But we'll get to that in the preview at the end. Now, Arsenal scored a second goal off a set piece. You could call it a fluke, but I want to show you why Arsenal's back post setup can be so dangerous. So as you can see here, you have five guys set up on the back post here. And, a lot of times what teams will do is they'll just sit in their line and they'll wait to see what Arsenal does, whether they stay back, whether they go through, and they kind of try to pick up guys as they go, which can be a very difficult thing to defend. And that's why Arsenal's so good at set pieces, on top of the fact that they have so many huge bodies in there that they can get on the ball. So here you can see on the back post, next image here, they're going to make a run across the face of PSG's line. PSG's line just stays right where they are. Nobody follows anybody. And Arsenal ends up getting a 3v2 at the front post, which is right where Saka put it. And the ball ends up going all the way through everybody into the back of the net. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, that's a fluke. Well, getting a 3v2 at the front post and getting all those bodies in there allowed Arsenal to essentially score that goal because, basically Party and I think it was Martinelli as well, had pretty much a free swing at it and just kind of missed it. So, you know, that is something that, and then, later on in the match, and as we'll see going forward, set pieces are going to play a huge role. And Arsenal is going to be incredibly dangerous on them, and PSG uh, is going to struggle just because of a sheer height disadvantage. Now, we get into the second half. Arsenal's got a two-goal lead, and so instead of just pressing high like they were for most of the first half, they started to sit back. Arsenal's from in my opinion the best out of possession team in the world because of their ability to press teams high like they did PSG. I mean, most of those danger zone losses that I showed you, the 40 danger zone losses, most of those came in the first half because as the second half started to progress, Arsenal just started sitting back and they sat back in their 4-4-2, and they are incredibly difficult to play through. So what happened was is Arsenal's front two just started shadowing PSG's double pivot. And when that happens, PSG essentially is not able to get a midfield overload. They were, essentially building up in like a 3-2-5. You can see, from the image here that, the the buildup is almost like a 3-2-3-2 in some aspects. But they just really weren't able to find any of that space centrally, and they had end up having to vacate it a lot of times and really maybe even try to overload out wide. But Arsenal, the way they moved their defensive block, always stayed compact, always made it sure that those passes were not getting in centrally. So the key point of that is that Arsenal, as you can see here, this is their 4-4-2 low block. You can see how compact and how much it pushes to side to how well they do it, how well drilled they are in pushing it side to side. But they stick to their zonal principles, and they're very good at picking up runners and exchanging guys off. That's really important because PSG with their fluid rotations, their wingers and forwards just go everywhere, right? Like one Kvaratskhelia might start out on the left, but he might play most of the second half on the right. Dembele might start as the lone striker, and then he ends up out wide. And suddenly maybe it's Vitinha essentially, or maybe it's João Neves as playing as playing as the main striker. The point is that why they do that is because it can make it very difficult for teams who want to man mark to push, trade guys off, or if guys, are attached to certain guys and follow them, that can pull guys out of position and create a lot of space in behind. With the zonal approach and in teams that are well drilled like Arsenal, you can do those positional rotations all you want. But as long as Arsenal is good at picking up guys and passing them off, they don't really mean much, and they don't really affect really good low block defending teams. So, as you can see from this image here from Mark's stats, this is a cluster of most of PSG's passes. As you can see, a lot of success, high pass rates here. What is that? 1, 2 displaced passes, essentially, playing the ball around. But you can see it's just a perfect arc, and it's just basically just rotating the ball side to side, trying to find space centrally, and they weren't able to do it. So the thing is when when you're down 2-0, or even in like an even game state, and you're trying to break down this type of low block, if you're not able to play the ball through centrally, there is your next option with a team like PSG and the wingers they have is to get them the ball, get them 1v1, and try and create chances, taking Arsenal off the dribble. As you can see here from FBref, PSG had 11 successful take-ons for the match, which is about what they average in Ligue 1, but their successful take-on percentage was 40.7%. Throughout all of their other Champions League matches, their successful take-on percentage is around 48%, so 8% less against Arsenal, who are essentially most of the time playing center backs as fullbacks. Now, obviously, Miles Lewis Skelly's in there, but he's a great 1v1 defender. So Arsenal doesn't really have any weaknesses here. So if you're not able to successfully take fullbacks off the dribble and try to send in crosses, how on earth are you going to create chances? Well, you're going to take a lot of low quality looks from outside the box. In the match, PSG attempted 18 crosses. 0 of them found a PSG player in the box. They completed none of them. So that leads to this as your shots for the match and your XG ratings on those shots. As you can see, there is not a single shot with an XG rating over 1. That is bad. That is quite bad. And I'm looking at this here. I see what, one shot inside 16 yards that didn't come off a set piece. So now, to be fair to PSG, Dembele didn't play, and Kvaratskhelia obviously wasn't on the team yet. So you could say with those two guys in the lineup, PSG is out much more dangerous than having Kang and Lee as playing as the false nine. But just because those two guys are now in the lineup, I do not think that that automatically means that PSG is just going to be able to play through Arsenal because very few teams have been able to play through Arsenal this season. Um, I mentioned this last, I think it was, I can't remember how many episodes it was ago, but essentially over the last two seasons, Arsenal has only conceded over 2 goals in one match, and it came in a crazy match against Luton Town. Otherwise, Arsenal has been incredible defensively. Not only just not even conceding goals. I mean, they're allowing 0.87, or excuse me, they're allowing, hang on, let me look it up here. They are allowing 0.78 non-penalty expected goals in per 90 in the Premier League, and in the Champions League, it's 0.68. So, you average those out, it's like 0.73. Doesn't matter. The point is Arsenal is really good defensively. They don't allow a lot of chances. In fact, the only time that they allowed over 1.5 expected goals in a match was in the second leg against PSV when they were already up 7-1 on aggregate. And they obviously rotated their squad. Only 1.9 expected goals allowed over the two legs against Real Madrid, 1.1 against Inter, like I mentioned, zero point 0.4 in the match against PSG. Other than that, the elite teams that Arsenal has played, they have completely shut them down. And so now let's move into the preview aspect of this thing. So from that first leg, what can we take from it and how are things going to change? So let's start off with PSG in possession versus Arsenal out of possession. Now, the introduction of Kvaratskhelia has made PSG more dangerous. There's no doubt about that. And their position rotations and their ability to overload the middle of the pitch against anybody has caused them to be so dangerous. And obviously, Dembele being in the lineup, along with, all of their great attackers, makes them really, really difficult to defend. And Arsenal's going to be without Gabriel. So I think the biggest question here is how does PSG play out against Arsenal's press? I mentioned one of the ways that PSG was able to find a way out against Liverpool because early on in the second leg against Liverpool at Anfield, Liverpool was actually really effective with their pressing and was kind of smothering PSG for about 20 minutes. So the change that Luis Enrique made was he started to drop Dembele in deep. And like I mentioned, with Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson in there, who aren't really great defenders, PSG, or excuse me, Liverpool couldn't really leave them on islands, and Virgil van Dijk and Konate are not really guys who like to drop in with strikers or pull or essentially give away the space in behind. So Dembele was just free to come and create a 4v3 overload in the middle. Arsenal's not going to allow that to happen. They are going to track the runners in there, and PSG's not going to be able to have that type of escape route. So what does Luis Enrique do? Well, I think a couple options for him to do is to drop, whether it be Dembele or somebody in deep to create that space, and then play balls over the top and just allow Barcola, whether it's Desiree Doué or Kvaratskhelia or whoever's playing out wide, to just try and go in 1v1s against Timber and against Miles Lewis Skelly. I think would be PSG's best option. But obviously, Luis Enrique doesn't really want to do that. He wants to try to play through teams. I'm telling you, getting the ball to the left side of the pitch and just trying to play through that area is not going to work. So that is the question I think we all need to see answered, is that what does PSG do when Arsenal's press is suffocating? Donnarumma is not really somebody who's that great on the ball with his feet. And, a lot of times teams will give him the option of playing a looping pass to the fullbacks. Well, when you do that, you obviously allow the defenders a lot of time to get in and close down the ball. Although those passes are free, they're actually not. So I think PSG has very few options on how they can consistently play through Arsenal. Now, there's obviously transition breaks, although Arsenal doesn't really allow those either. And then you have to ask the question, okay, if they're not able to overload the middle of the pitch, if Arsenal decides to sit back in their 4-4-2, how are they going to actually create chances? Well, their wingers are going to have to beat Arsenal's fullbacks out wide. That's just what it's going to have to come down to. Because if they try to come with the approach they did last time, which was, essentially tilt the field, create a good rest defense and basically play the ball around and try to find, pockets of space in the middle, they couldn't find any. So, and when you don't have aerial threats in the box and you're not going to win headers against Arsenal, that becomes a very big issue. So, what I'm saying here is because PSG has been, outstanding over these, last few months, it doesn't mean they're automatically going to walk into the Emirates and have a better and completely flip the script and have a better performance than they did back in October. Actually, I think it's way more likely that they are going to get completely shut down here in this first leg, and that Arsenal's going to have a similar performance that they had against Real Madrid in the quarterfinals. Now, for Arsenal in possession, I think Arsenal's ability to build out of the back and play through PSG is going to be very, very critical. And I say that because they always have the option of playing direct, right? They always have the option of just sending the ball long and trying to win duels and second balls. Also, Arsenal's very good at that. There's no problem and there's no shame in doing that. Um, but if they are consistently able to invert Miles Lewis Skelly and drop whether it be Odegaard or Moreno, my guess would be Moreno would play as a false nine. I don't know if I'll play Trossard as a false nine. We'll see, but my guess would be Moreno. That's what I would hope Arsenal would do. That will do is if you keep Martinelli and you keep Saka wide, they're going to be 1v1. And there is going to be space in behind if PSG's center backs are tracking Moreno and Odegaard, right? Otherwise, Arsenal's going to have an overload and they're going to be able to hope and they're going to be able to play through PSG. And that will make it even more difficult when Arsenal is essentially running at them in some of those transition breaks, like I showed you, the one that Declan Rice had in the first half against PSG in the first leg. So in the end, you know, in the first meeting, PSG did have a pass per defensive action of 8.3, but like I already showed you, Arsenal was pretty consistently able to get through that first phase of build up and cause a lot of problems for PSG. So the other thing that I would be looking at for Arsenal is when they get the ball into PSG's final third, I would look to cross the ball in the box for two reasons. First, like I said, I'd imagine, Moreno's going to play as a false nine, which gives Arsenal an aerial threat in the box. But secondly, Arsenal is more than likely going to try and overload the right side of the pitch, or even Martinelli's side of wide areas, essentially. But they obviously love to favor Saka's side of the pitch. So when they get in those type of situations, they're able to send in crosses. You can see like an image right here. Arsenal can just throw guys more towards the back post instead of trying to get balls that send crosses, whether it be on the ground. Look at the positioning of Pacho and Marquinhos. They're not marking anybody right here. And in fact, this ball ends up finding Havertz at the back post, and he actually had a free header and almost scored. So situations like this can be really, really key for Arsenal, getting the ball away from PSG's two aerial threats, because PSG by nature, João Neves, Vitinha, Mendes, Hakimi, they're short. Like, for lack of a better term, they're short. And that leads me into this next. Arsenal on set pieces. It just brings such a smile to my face every single time I get to talk about Arsenal set pieces. They're going to be huge in this match. Previous meeting, like I mentioned, they scored one against PSG, and PSG is short. They don't face set piece offenses like Arsenal in Ligue 1. They're 11th in XG per set piece allowed in France. And against Aston Villa over the two legs, they only had a 45% aerial duel win rate. So for Arsenal, load up on the set pieces, do your back post overloads, and just know that you are going to have a huge advantage in the air. So, what this match is likely going to come down to is, can PSG defend crosses and set pieces? If they can't, Arsenal's going to score. And how does PSG actually build up against Arsenal's pressure? And actually, can they break down their low block? I think those are huge question marks that PSG needs to answer and we need to see, because I'm telling you right now, Arsenal is a massive level above defensively to what Liverpool and Aston Villa are. and PSG is not going to find the same amount of space and the same amount of chances that they did against those two teams like they will here against Arsenal. But thank you all for listening and watching this episode of Unexpected Goals. I will be back with a preview of Barcelona versus Inter sometime tomorrow. Until then, enjoy Arsenal versus PSG, and I'll catch you later.